History has always reserved a special place for kings who ruled with brilliance, valor, or cruelty. But there was one ruler whose story unraveled not through war or betrayal, but through the very symbol of his power. His end came not from sword or poison, but from a crown he demanded be made to glorify himself beyond all reason. This is the tale of King Charles of Navarre, a monarch whose obsession with eternal prestige led him to create a crown so grand, so heavy, so grotesquely beautiful, that it would ultimately claim his life. Charles was not born into greatness. He clawed his way to the throne with ambition and cunning, ascending at a time when Europe teetered between the old world and the new. His early years as king were marked by reform and charisma. The people adored him, for a time. But as seasons passed and victories turned to indulgences, something shifted within him. He no longer ruled to lead, he ruled to be remembered. Haunted by the idea that history might overlook him, Charles became consumed by the notion of legacy. Not satisfied with monuments or coinage, he craved something immortal, something no king before him dared to create. He envisioned a crown unlike any in the known world. Not a symbol of authority, but a statement of divine right. A crown that would outshine the treasures of Rome, rival the sacred regalia of the French Bourbons, and dazzle beyond the imperial diadems of the East. He summoned artisans from across the continent, jewelers from Florence, metalworkers from Saxony, and gem traders from Constantinople. For months they toiled under secret orders, forbidden to speak of their task. Charles demanded not gold alone, but platinum fused with molten sapphire dust. He ordered the crown to be encrusted with opals from Bohemia, emeralds from the Andes, and diamonds from India, stones so large and rare they were said to carry curses of ancient gods. The centerpiece, however, was his most audacious demand, a crimson ruby the size of a dove's egg, to be set above his brow, a blood eye, he called it, that would stare down any who questioned his rule. But artisans warned him. The materials he demanded would make the crown unbearably heavy. It would press down on the spine, cause blinding headaches, perhaps even injury. But Charles dismissed them with laughter. "What is pain," he said, "when history itself shall kneel before me?" To ensure the crown's symbolism, Charles added yet another layer to his obsession. He ordered that fragments of swords from fallen enemies be melted into its frame, believing that by wearing them, he would be absorbing their power. It was part relic, part talisman, part grotesque idol to his ego. When the crown was finally complete, it was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Nearly 12 pounds of dense, dazzling metal and gems. It required 2 men to carry it to the royal chamber. And yet, Charles insisted it be worn not only during coronations, but at court, during audiences, and sometimes even during private meals. It became a ritual, a fetish. His crown was to never leave his head in public. He began to wear it with obsessive pride, despite the pain that followed. Whispers emerged of the king staggering under its weight, of his neck stiffening, his posture curving. Physicians warned of spinal stress and blood restriction. Still, Charles would not yield. "The crown is my breath," he declared. But behind the glittering jewels, beneath the sculpted band, the seeds of his downfall had been forged. This was no longer just a crown. It was a slow-moving executioner. As the crown settled deeper into the bones of his skull, so too did King Charles's delusions sink into the very marrow of his kingdom. Navarre had once been a modest but proud realm, its people industrious, its nobility pragmatic, its coffers healthy though never overflowing. But under Charles, that all began to change. His obsession with appearances, with divine grandeur and personal immortality, transformed a working monarchy into a bloated theater of vanity. The crown he forged in hubris was not just a physical burden, it became the blueprint for how he ruled. Every royal procession became a spectacle. Where past kings rode humble steeds and wore modest robes of silk, Charles paraded through villages on ivory-lit carriages pulled by white-coated stallions imported from Persia. His robes dragged for meters behind him, embroidered not with the symbols of state, but with his own initials, woven in threads of real gold. His likeness adorned every street corner, not merely in portraits, but in full-bodied statues where he was posed like a Roman god. He renamed cities. He renamed rivers. He even tried to rename entire months of the year after victories he had never won. The royal treasury, once filled with the careful savings of generations, groaned under the weight of his indulgences. Taxes were raised on grain, salt, and shoes, everyday items the commoners needed to survive. Farmers were forced to give up portions of their harvest so royal kitchens could host feasts for foreign dignitaries and domestic flatterers. Entire forests were cleared to build hunting lodges that Charles would use once or twice before abandoning. The nobility, sensing opportunity, began to mimic their king. What had once been a functioning aristocracy turned into a parade of sycophants and self-idolizers. Courtiers arrived at palace gates with jewels in their beards, falcons on their shoulders, and carriages shaped like swans. They spoke in poems no one understood and bowed so low they sometimes fainted from lack of breath. The court had become a circus, and Charles was its ringmaster. No one dared speak of the strain. Not of the starving peasants who sold their children into servitude to avoid tax prisons. Not of the soldiers who deserted because their pay was months late. Not of the masons and carpenters who toiled without wages on projects meant solely to glorify their king's image. Anyone who questioned the crown, either the literal one or the symbolic weight it carried, was swiftly silenced. Some disappeared into dungeon cells beneath the palace, where screams echoed for days. Others were banished, their lands seized and names erased from court records. A few brave souls tried to appeal to Charles's former self, the reformer, the promising ruler who once spoke of justice. But that man was long gone. His obsession had festered into paranoia. He believed his crown protected him not only from dissent, but from death itself. One chronicler noted that Charles refused to let royal physicians touch his head, fearing they might steal the spirit of kingship that lived within the metal band. His sleep grew shorter. His moods darker. He would sit for hours, unmoving, beneath the weight of the crown, staring into the mirrors he had placed all around the throne room. One mirror cracked on its own during a storm. When Charles saw the fractured image of himself, he flew into a rage and ordered every mirror in the palace destroyed. He screamed that the crack had been a warning from a rival court. But some whispered that he saw truth in that reflection, something he could not unsee. The kingdom was beginning to rot from the top down. And still, he wore the crown. Not as a symbol of rule, but as a prison of his own making. They say stones carry memory. That some gems are born cursed, infused with the grief of empires that have fallen, or soaked in the blood of those who died clutching them. Whether you believe such things or not, what cannot be denied is that the crown of King Charles was more than just gold and glitter. It was a mosaic of warnings. Each jewel had a story. And each story, like a whisper in the dark, foretold something the king refused to hear. The opals, fire-flecked and deep with color, had been taken from a monastery in Bohemia during a raid. The monks who once guarded them had spoken of the demon's eye, a gem so cursed that it turned once noble men to madness. Charles found the tale amusing and demanded the largest stone be set on the back of his crown, to watch the cowards who stand behind me. The emeralds were no less troubling. Acquired from a dying noble in the Andes, they were said to have been mined by slaves in caves where no birds sang, and where men emerged with green-stained hands and blind eyes. But to Charles, their vivid glow was not a warning, it was prestige. He had them set at the temples, believing their proximity would grant him wisdom and visions. And then there was the ruby. Blood red. Almost unnatural in color. No one could say exactly where it came from. Some whispered it had been stolen from a Maharaja's tomb. Others claimed it was found clutched in the skeletal hands of a child buried beneath the ruins of an ancient city. It was cracked down the center, as if trying to split itself in two. Yet this was the stone Charles called the Eye of Power, and he had it placed directly above his brow. There were others too, diamonds that had once adorned the sword of a tyrant who died screaming in flames. A pearl rumored to have been plucked from the crown of a queen who drowned herself in her bath. Each gem brought tales. Superstition. Folklore. The king laughed at all of it. But the crown maker, a renowned Florentine named Lucenzo di Aquila, did not. He was an old man, his hands gnarled like tree roots, and his eyes sharp from decades of detail work. He pleaded with the king during the final stages of the crown's construction. "Sire," he whispered, "stones have weight that is not of the body. These carry pain." Charles stared at him, unsmiling. "Let them. I will wear their pain as my triumph." Lucenzo did not speak again. He finished the crown in silence and retired shortly thereafter. Some say he fled the kingdom in fear. Others claimed he went mad, muttering about stones that sing. But it was not long after the crown's debut that strange things began to happen. Charles started complaining of headaches. Not the sort cured with sleep or herbs, but deep, splitting migraines that blurred his vision and sent lightning down his spine. He grew irritable. Suspicious. At court he would pause mid-sentence, suddenly confused, staring into space as if listening to something no one else could hear. He began muttering to the crown when he thought no one was listening. Speaking to the stones as if they were advisors. Once, during a banquet, he shouted at a noble for interrupting the sapphire. Another time, he struck down a servant because the opal told him of betrayal. Physicians inspected the crown and found nothing, except its extraordinary weight. Some suggested it be worn less frequently. Charles flew into a rage and had them whipped for treason. At night, he often woke screaming, clutching his head. Servants heard him sobbing, begging something unseen to stop whispering. By now, the people whispered too. Not about the jewels, but about their king. They said he was no longer alone in his mind. That perhaps he never had been. There are coronations meant to mark the dawn of a golden age, days lit with banners, bells, and the collective hope of a kingdom. Then there are coronations that feel more like funerals, heavy with omens, where even the sun seems reluctant to rise. King Charles's final great ceremony was of the latter kind. It was not his actual coronation. That had taken place years before, when he was still young, admired, and full of promise. No, this was something different. A recrowning, he called it. A public reaffirmation of his divine rule. A performance staged not for tradition, but for ego. He ordered it on the eve of his 50th birthday, declaring it would be the most magnificent ceremony the world had ever seen. He claimed it would symbolize the second half of his reign, his ascension from mortal king to eternal legend. Invitations were sent across Europe. Dukes, cardinals, envoys, merchants, and even enemies arrived, too curious to decline. After all, when a king promises immortality, people come to see if he'll actually grasp it, or be crushed by it. Preparations began months in advance. The Grand Cathedral of Navarre was bathed in gold and violet fabrics. Stained glass windows depicting saints were replaced with panes featuring Charles's own likeness, haloed, smiling, hand raised like a messiah. Streets were cleaned and draped in white. Townspeople were given bread and wine not out of generosity, but to ensure cheers and tears on cue. And at the center of it all, behind a veil of white silk, sat the crown. Now a myth unto itself, it was revealed only once before the ceremony. Onlookers gasped not in awe, but in unease. The thing was enormous. So encrusted in stones and twisted metal that it looked more like a torture device than a symbol of rule. Its crimson ruby, the eye of power, seemed to glint even in darkness. On the day of the recrowning, the skies were overcast. Rain threatened but never fell, only a dense, warm mist that clung to every robe and stone. The people gathered in silence, their cheers fading into nervous murmurs. It wasn't excitement that filled the air. It was dread. Charles entered the cathedral in full regalia, each step slow and labored. The weight of his robe alone dragged behind him like a shroud. But still, he held his head high, though those close enough could see his eyes twitching, his lips moving in strange, silent words. The choir began to sing. Trumpets blared. And the bishop approached with shaking hands. Though he had officiated dozens of ceremonies in his life, this one made his heart race in fear. He hesitated only briefly, before raising the crown toward the heavens. Charles reached for it himself. "No man may place it upon me," he had declared days earlier. "Only I may bear the burden of my destiny." And so, with a trembling neck and clenched jaw, he lifted the crown with both hands. His arms shook under its weight. The gems seemed to shimmer unnaturally as if alive. Then, slowly, he placed it upon his head. The cathedral fell silent. For one long moment, nothing happened. Then, Charles smiled. It was faint at first, then broader. His lips parted as though he were hearing music no one else could hear. He raised his hands as if to bless the crowd, and the nobles erupted into polite applause. But as they clapped, he did not lower his arms. His smile froze. His knees buckled. And then, before anyone could react, King Charles collapsed. The crown slid slightly to one side but did not fall. Guards rushed forward. The bishop dropped his scepter. A noble screamed. Servants surged toward the altar, only to be pushed back by the royal guard. Charles lay still. His eyes open. His lips parted in a grin that now seemed carved in stone. A physician approached, pressing fingers to his pulse, then shook his head with pale silence. The coronation had ended. Not in applause, but in horror. The moment King Charles fell to the marble floor of the grand cathedral, the silence that followed was more than just shock, it was the cracking of something deep and unspoken. A spell, perhaps, or a delusion that had bound an entire kingdom in gold-threaded denial. When the crown slipped sideways but didn't fall, it seemed to symbolize exactly what Charles had created, a kingdom grotesquely balanced on his ego, now dangerously tilting. At first, no one dared say the king was dead. Not the nobles, not the bishop, not even the queen, who stood frozen near the altar, her painted smile still fixed like a mask. For a long moment, they waited, as if expecting him to rise, make a jest, and accuse them of weak stomachs. But Charles didn't move. His lips remained parted. His eyes stayed glassy. And then, slowly, the whispers began. One physician, pale as chalk, stammered to a nearby courtier, his spine, it's compressed. Crushed, perhaps. The weight, it may have severed something inside. Another murmured about blood vessels. About pressure on the brain. About signs of collapse long in the making. But none of it mattered now. The man was gone, and all that remained was his crown, glinting atop his lifeless body like a parasite clinging to its host. The crown was removed only after heated debate. 2 guards were ordered to lift it, but as they did, one nearly dropped it, wincing from the strain. They placed it in a velvet-lined box, sealed it, and carried it into the vault below the cathedral. It was said neither man spoke for days afterward. Back at court, chaos stirred like a wind before a storm. Charles had left no clear heir. His sons, all born of different mothers and riddled with rivalries, each laid claim to the throne. The eldest, Prince Thomas, arrived late, and upon seeing his father's body, reportedly said, "He always said the crown would kill him." But we all thought he meant metaphorically. The nobles, once proud and flamboyant, now scrambled to distance themselves from Charles's excesses. Robes embroidered with his sigil were quietly burned. Portraits were taken down in the dead of night. Some began to suggest, quietly, that the king's end was divine punishment, a lesson in humility. But the damage was already done. The treasury was empty. The grain reserves, depleted by years of extravagance and export to fund celebrations, left villages starving. Roads had crumbled under the weight of decorative statues and ceremonial arches. The royal army, unpaid and poorly supplied, began to fracture. Some commanders defected to border lords, others simply vanished. And then came the rumors that Charles had gone mad, that the jewels were cursed, that his death had been the final act in a pact with something not quite human. Commoners began to speak of a whispering crown that drove its wearer to ruin. Parents warned their children, "Do not ask for too much, or the crown will come for you." Religious leaders declared a week of mourning. But privately, they debated whether to exorcise the crown itself. One bishop suggested melting it down. Another insisted it be locked away, deep underground. But every proposal met resistance from those who saw its value, not as a relic, but as a bargaining chip in the power struggle that followed. Meanwhile, the people suffered. Inflation soared. Crime rose. Once loyal provinces broke away. What had been a realm of lavish feasts and gilded palaces now became a land of empty tables and shuttered windows. The crown may have crushed the man beneath it, but it shattered the kingdom that worshipped it. What Charles had built in gold and blood dissolved in whispers, famine, and fire. His death had not just ended a life, it had exposed the unbearable weight of a reign built on spectacle, not strength. They buried him in silence. No parade. No 21-gun salute. No golden hearse or heavenly choir. Just a sealed coffin, a heavy slab of stone, and the eerie stillness of a palace that once throbbed with music and flattery. The body of King Charles of Navarre, once adored, feared, mocked, and mythologized, was laid to rest beneath the royal crypt, but even in death, the weight of his crown lingered like a curse over the nation he left behind. And it was not just metaphor. Within days of his passing, royal physicians, under pressure from the nobility and desperate for answers, were ordered to conduct a discreet postmortem. It wasn't publicized. In fact, it was done in near secrecy, deep beneath the cathedral where torchlight flickered against stone walls like trembling shadows. The findings were more disturbing than anyone expected. The vertebrae in Charles's neck had been compressed, crushed, actually, by years of unnatural strain. The bones of his upper spine showed signs of damage consistent with chronic, excessive weight. There were microfractures along his skull, as if the pressure from above had slowly pressed the crown downward over time, like a vice tightening with each passing year. Blood vessels at the back of his brain had ruptured, likely during his final moments in the cathedral. The weight, they concluded, had quite literally broken him. But the physical wounds weren't the only things they found. Beneath his scalp, there were strange lesions, tiny scars that one physician believed were linked to prolonged exposure to the materials in the crown. Some speculated poisoning. Others whispered of something stranger. Several of the gemstones, particularly the opals and that monstrous crimson ruby, were known to contain trace minerals that could, when kept too close to the skin for extended periods, lead to neurological decay. One physician, a rational man with decades of service to the crown, reportedly resigned after the examination. There was something unnatural about it, he was overheard telling a servant. As if the crown didn't want to be removed. The crown itself was never displayed again. Locked behind iron doors in the deepest vault of the palace, it was placed under armed guard and hidden from public memory. A decree was issued declaring it a forbidden relic of former glory, and no monarch since has dared place it upon their head. But that didn't stop the stories. Palace guards began to report strange sounds near the vault, a low hum, barely audible, like distant chanting. Some claimed the temperature near the door was always colder, even in summer. Others swore they saw flickers of red light from the cracks in the stone. Then, one night, a soldier assigned to the vault detail disappeared without a trace. His sword was found lying in the hallway. No blood. No signs of struggle. Just his helmet, and a single opal, resting where he had last been seen. After that, the crown was moved again, this time to an undisclosed location. Only 3 people knew where it went. All died within the decade. But Charles remained, buried far below the palace, encased in a stone sarcophagus said to weigh nearly a ton. A statue above him shows him in repose, but without the crown, his head bare, his expression oddly peaceful. Visitors are few. Most avoid the crypt altogether, and the tour guides never speak his name aloud. But when asked, they will sometimes repeat the old saying that emerged after his death. He ruled with gold upon his head, until the gold pressed in instead. No blade, no war, no whispered plot. Just jewels, and time, and what pride wrought. In the end, it was not the rebellion of subjects or the betrayal of friends that claimed him. It was the crown. His pride. His monument. His executioner. Years passed. Then decades. Then centuries. And still, the name of King Charles of Navarre lingered, though not in the way he had hoped. He had once dreamed of eternal praise, of statues that outlasted stone and songs that echoed through empires. But instead, his legacy became a cautionary tale. A whispered fable of opulence gone mad. A parable repeated in history books, sermons, and quiet warnings to those who rose too high on the scaffolding of ego. The kingdom itself never fully recovered. After Charles's death, the royal court fractured under the weight of his debts and the vacuum of leadership. His sons, too eager to claim the throne, turned on each other. Civil unrest boiled into open conflict. Provinces splintered. The once unified realm of Navarre was carved into smaller territories by opportunistic lords and foreign powers. Within 3 generations, the crown Charles had worshipped was spoken of as a curse. The royal house that bore his name faded into obscurity, its banners torn down, its bloodline scattered or absorbed into lesser nobility. The golden halls were emptied. The palace fell into decay. Ivy crept over marble. Dust dulled the frescoes of his imagined glory. But the crown itself, that was never forgotten. Hidden deep in the annals of private archives and coded letters, its last known location remained a secret. Occasionally, a scholar or treasure hunter would rise up claiming to have discovered a map, a clue, a passage from a lost journal that hinted at the vault. Most failed. A few vanished. Some even went mad. In art and literature, the story of King Charles morphed into legend. Painters rendered his likeness with hollow eyes and crimson light glinting from his crown. Poets described his descent not as a fall, but as a devouring, swallowed whole by the very image he tried to project. In the villages, the tale was told as a fireside warning to children. Do not bow to gold that bends your neck. Do not wear pride like armor. For when the weight grows too great, it is not the crown that breaks, but you. Among kings and rulers that followed, Charles became a ghost. His portrait was used in political philosophy lectures as a symbol of absolute vanity. Scholars debated whether he was mad from the beginning or driven so by the crown's strange influence. Historians pored over correspondence from the final years of his reign, analyzing the sudden changes in tone, the obsessive language, the gaps in logic. But perhaps the most disturbing part of his legacy was not written in ink. It was the silence. The silence of no clear successor. No heir who could carry his burden. No statue that truly lasted. No dynasty that bore his name with pride. What remained of Charles was the echo of his downfall, a kingdom that crumbled from the head down, an empire lost beneath the weight of one man's refusal to kneel to anything but himself. And the crown? Some say it still exists. Sealed behind iron doors, buried beneath forgotten stone, waiting. Others believe it was melted down, reforged into coins that now pass from hand to hand, spreading the curse like embers in a pocket. But most believe this: that every time a ruler gazes too long into a mirror, every time power tempts a man to believe he is more than flesh and bone, the crown whispers again. Invisible, but heavy, and always waiting for another head foolish enough to wear it.